So today, I would like to talk about the work
sharing.
Yeah, just 1 second. So, as part of the work that we're doing in Spaces project, we're improving the way we are dealing with permissions. And today I want to talk about the solutions that we're implementing, and hopefully we'll get some feedback, whether this is something you like or not, what can be improved. When it comes to permissions, there's no perfect solution. So we're trying to solve a couple of problems, and I'll explain first what the problems are and then the solutions we're proposing. So let's start with problems. The first problem that we have with permissions is inconsistency at the conceptual level. What that means is we have variables in multiple places of the system. They're implemented slightly differently, and because of that, different permissions are applied to them. Sometimes different permissions and sometimes permissions with different scopes. So project variables are handled pretty well. We still have gaps there, but this is the best implementation that we have right now. We use the right permissions, and we, in most cases, use the right scopes and restrictions. Tenant variables, they use some of the restrictions, until recently not that many.
When you say restrictions, you mean scope, environment?
Yeah, so you can scope, and that's another thing we are trying to fix, the way we name things. So restrictions and scopes are the same things. You can belong to a team that is restricted to a project, to an environment, to a tenant, to a project group. At the same time, we call it a scope. It's kind of the same thing. So project variables do all those checks in most cases properly. Tenant variables, not really. Variable sets at all. Conceptually, they're all the same things, but they treat permissions in different ways. Then we have inconsistency at the API level, and this is an example I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, where when we return a list of certain things, we apply one set of roles. When we retrieve only one thing from that list, we apply a different set of roles. And this is just an inconsistency, and possibly was done by two different people. I don't know what the reason is, but that's where we ended up. And that's just an example. Then we have inconsistencies at the kind of create, update, delete level, at the level of a single document. It's not obvious to everybody that when we return a document that it's scoped to, let's say, certain environments. Let's use accountant as an example. We have an account that is scoped to a set of environments. We will return that account if you, as a user, have view access to at least one of those environments. Well, when we persist changes to the account, you have to have access to all of the environments. So it takes a while to figure out why it's done this way. But as you can imagine, that's not consistently done this way. So another inconsistency. And yeah, there are more questions. And then there's the permission API. This is basically our high-level API that we use everywhere, which accepts permission and bunch of strings. And you don't really even know what they are. They are document IDs, but we're passing also some magic values there. So first of all, there's nothing that tells you actually have to check permissions. So that has happened before, that we were about to release something without checking permissions. Are you sure you actually checked them properly? Did you check all the restrictions and all scopes that you should check? Maybe yes, maybe no. Sometimes people would pass to this API multiple documents of the same type, like multiple environments. You're not allowed to do that, but that blows up only at runtime. So there's no compile time check. I think we just recently fixed a bug, and we fix them on a regular basis. So that's the summary. And it's not us. We need a bit of help. This is really complex area, and we need some tooling around. We need that kind of personal assistant that will tell us what we are doing wrong. And ideally, we don't even have to be familiar with the details on a regular basis. When we build something new, yes. But when we use an existing things, we shouldn't have to. Okay, so these were our goals. Use tools as much as possible, whatever they are, unit test, compiler, whatever is available to us. In the same way, reduce the feedback cycle. So instead of either shipping a bug or having failing tests, let's do it in such a way so when you make a change, you get that feedback straight away that something, you missed something or something is incorrectly configured. We knew we are not going to fix all the problems, and I will explain why. So we wanted to maintain safety net. So in the way the current solution works is that if you don't specify permissions in most cases, we fall back to you having to be a system administrator, which is a good thing to do. So we wanted to maintain that. And this is why we couldn't fix all the problems, because we had this discussion before and we decided we're not touching permissions, like the structure of the permissions. And we have over 110 permissions at the moment, and that creates the complexity by itself, but we decided we're not touching that thing. All right, so the first realization we had is that we are checking permissions at the API level, though when you look at our permissions, they are expressed at the model level. You have machine edit, you have account edit, machine view, account view. Most of them are structured this way. So what we've decided to do is, okay, well, let's express the permissions that apply to a given model at the model level. So then every time you use Nevermore to access that model, we will always apply the same permissions no matter what. You don't have to duplicate them in every new API you're building. The second thing we decided to do is to make the scopes explicit. So when you build, when you specify permissions for a new model, you have to tell us all the scopes and all the restrictions that apply to it. They are not specified now in the permission enumeration. It's the actual implementation that drives that. That was one of the problems. The permission would say, well, I have 3 scopes, and then the check would supply 1, 2, 3, any combination of them, really. So now, at startup, we build like a map of those scopes. And then if there are 2 models that happen to use the same permission, but they supply different scopes, we'll crash, we'll throw an exception because that's incorrect. Like you need, one permission comes with a predefined set of scopes. They can't be different. So that's one thing we are doing. And if you forget about them, we have a test and I will tell you. So if you add a new model and there is no explicit restriction specified, you will have a failure. It's still possible. So this works on obviously only with types that we know about during the build time. So extensions are one of cases where types are supplied externally. So if we get a document and we don't have a restriction for it, at runtime we'll fall back to admin only. So that's kind of the safety net. For extensions, actually, we have access to the base class. You can specify permissions at the level of the base class. So you don't have to repeat them for, let's say, all different accounts, all different configuration settings of all extensions. So in most cases, all we need is the base class, and then we can derive the rest. I showed you really a simple example here where you specify a bunch of permissions and then where the scopes or restrictions are coming from. If you have something more complex, you can create a custom restriction where we give you a very specific extension points. So you can provide code that we that will execute on when you create a new document, when you update, when you load by ID, or when you already have it loaded, when you try to delete it. We already have an API for you to persist unmodified data. So very often we have cases where we want to compare before and after. to make a decision whether you have access to it. For example, to modify restrictions on the account, you have to have access to all the existing environments and then to all the new environments that you're supplying. So both collections needs to be checked. So that's all built in now. We also recognize that our API, our permissions are a mix of model level permissions and API level permissions. So model level permission is edit account, view account, and so on. Action level permission is task cancel. So it's a very specific action. It's a state transition that we guard with a specific permission. So we allow you to be explicit about that. So now every responder needs, so there's an abstract property on the base class of the base responder. And when you create a new responder, you have to explicitly tell us whether there is an action level permission or not. Again, that won't compile if you don't. The checks are enabled by default. So when you get a transaction from the store, you will get a transaction that will execute those restrictions for you. In some cases, you need to get out of the current scope. So for example, when we return license status, we need to retrieve the license. To retrieve the license, you have to have, I think, system admin. Yeah. But everybody can see the status because it's like an aggregate or a subset of data. So what we do there, we impersonate for that one call as an admin. So we give you that ability to change the current scope of the transaction to someone else. We decided to do it explicitly, so you think twice before you do that. And second of all, it's really easy to pick up during a code review.
So it's a pseudo, basically.
Yeah. So that's basically what it is. We have a system admin and system runner, which is a kind of a new concept we're trying to introduce for actions that should never be executed by end users. So it's only systems. So let's say users should never create events or audit. So, and then we have a generic method which allows you to create your own principal, like with limited permissions if you want. We use this method, for example, when you log in. So we create a user, we create a principal with enough permissions so we can log you in as a user, but we're not using a system admin. So we're trying to restrict things as much as possible. Initially, we went with unrestricted, but we didn't want to have like a backdoor in the system where we bypass things. It was like, okay, just run as an admin, that's fine, but we still apply checks. Okay. There's still code. So it was easy for us to port the custom persistent rules to restrictions, and we extracted some permission code from responders, but there are still really complex responders where permission checks are interleaved with the logic, permissions being prime example here, permissions variables. So this is why I said, well, we think we are going in the right direction. And when we unify variables and we have a single model for them, then we can move to restrictions, and this all should work together really nicely. But until we unify them, we can't really go there because they are all unique snowflakes.
Are you planning on doing that after Space Design? Is that what you're saying? Sounds like what you're saying.
Take a long leave. Holidays, which I already have booked. Yeah. And the second thing is the permission check. We have like 3 different security contexts in Octopus, the way I see it at least. The first one is the server commands and the scheduler. The second one is the web API. And the third one is the background task processing. Let's put it this way. The permissions checks are applied only in the web context when we have end user interacting with Octopus. We try to use that in all other cases, but in most cases we need raw access to the database from these places. So it was really hard for us to do it properly. Nothing stops us from going back and basically using this approach in the other contexts. But for now, we didn't see that much value The way this is all done is basically a wraparound transaction we get from Nevermore. So spaces will be spaces with their extensions, and adding those where clauses for space ID will be done the same way you add another wrapper on top of that. So we have like a stack of wrappers. That's pretty much it. That's where we are. Any questions either now or ping the team in team modeling channel?
Is this on the spaces branch or is this in master?
This is in the permissions branch. We are now working on fixing tests in spaces and permissions, and hopefully we'll be merging them this week.
Sounds like it all makes sense. It'd be interesting to have a bit of a look and play around with it before I really have any questions.
Sure. Yeah, it's permissions branch if you want the latest.
Yeah, I think the biggest difficulty is that one you pointed out is where we do have APIs where we interleave the permissions, like we'll load a bit and then check some permissions and then do something else and then check some permissions. That's hard to make any more declarative, right?
Yeah. The question is whether we can simplify that, whether we need those checks, whether we can say, well, we need to just simplify it. It won't work the same way it used to, but it's at least.
Did you find many apart from the variables? Because I know
package push is another one.
Yeah,
it's a bit funny because that reaches out and says spaces will help with fixing that and having a feed.
Oh no, this one is gone. We decided to remove it.
Great. Done.
Yes, we have a list of breaking changes. We'll be publishing them, and this is exactly what we said. In certain cases, we saw like there's a lot of complexity, and it's like, is it worth really like this effort? And then we found, let's say, gaps, and it's like, now let's simplify it.
And did you find many places where we do permission checks in those background tasks, like non-API triggered?
So in most cases, you just need to impersonate as a system or like the system runner anyway, because there's no other principal.
But there's no cases where we kind of do anything where we go, this task is now running separate because it was scheduled or whatever. But for it to do something else, we need to verify that the user who triggered it has permission X or is in role Y. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any. Just wondering if you guys hit any.
I think the only one that's like that is the deployment triggers. So those are created at the time they're created. We check the right permissions, and then when they actually run, they run as the system runner. So I think that's the only other edge case. That
permissions change in the meantime. We just assume that because it was fun when you triggered it, it's all fun, and that was already.
Yeah, so that's how we did work, and that's how we'll continue to work.
Yeah, fair enough. Cool.
Nick, the only other one I can think of that's related to that is the subscriptions. The email handling for subscriptions does some checking around the individual team members who it's sending emails to make sure exactly what they have visibility to, because it's aggregating up information and it will mask the things they don't have access to.
That's right. So for that one, we impersonate the user. So for each user that needs to get a subscription, we use that principal impersonator to get their permissions, and we'll only retrieve the events that they can access and be notified.
That's all nicely worked.
Yeah, I mean, that's,
yeah.
Excellent.
Cool. Sounds good. Nice work.
Nice.
Yeah.
It's the whole team. A lot of hours.
I will just take all the credit. That's what being a team lead's about, right?
No.
Let's talk about it. All right, cool. Thank you.